Ben is, first of all, he put this at the bottom of his bio, but I want to point out that Ben is on the board of directors of the Moon Society. He is the membership coordinator and is running for treasurer. He is actively involved in most Moon Society activities. And in my very short tenure working with the Moon Society, Ben, Michael, and James have been really terrific to work with.
Thank you.
That's not me sucking up. Like, I actually like you guys. So his bio, here we go. Ben is an independent lunar settlement scientist and owner of Lunar Homestead. Lunar Homestead operates from the viewpoint that governments and corporations are not going to settle the lunar frontier, that groups of motivated individuals will. Ben and other Lunar Homestead crew members are working on developing the technology and techniques that lunar homesteaders will need to thrive. His current primary project is Shielded Pressurized Oxygen Resource Extraction, codenamed SPORE. SPORE combines resource extraction with habitable space creation, while avoiding or minimizing the hazards of lunar surface operations. To facilitate SPORE research, Ben is also working on lunar cast iron habitat pressure hulls and the manual universal power system called MUPS. Other projects include extracting oxygen and iron from lunar basalt, using lunar basalt to create pressure hulls, and creating videos and books explaining the lunar homestead concept and lunar science. Ben, it's terrific having you. Looking forward to this. Thank you very much, sir. It's all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Smith. I own Lunar Homestead, and we're researching the tech needed for sustainable, small-scale lunar settlements. And you can help, but we'll get to that in a bit. All right, this was going to be a purely technical presentation, but I've been asked to give you a brief introduction to the Lunar Homestead concept and how this project fits into it. Okay, so what I'm going to say will be a little controversial, and you already heard it in the bio. So please hold the fruit and vegetable throwing for the end. The core of the Lunar Homestead concept is that governments and businesses are not going to be the first to settle the moon, Mars, or the rest of the solar system. There are a number of reasons why, and I detail them on the website. Today, however, I'm going to just mention the one. They are the wrong tools for the job because being the first to settle anywhere entails substantial risk. Now, risk was covered yesterday by people far more knowledgeable than I am about it. However, here's my 30-second amateur observation. Politicians would be risking their current job and any future political gains if they publicly pushed a government-funded lunar settlement. And the reason is that the overwhelming majority of voters in the US, and I assume around the world, don't care or even think about lunar settlement. And they would be almost certainly vocally opposed to their government spending their money on something they think is frivolous, especially when there are so many other obvious problems to deal with here on Earth. And businesses would be risking more than just potential financial losses. They risk becoming vulnerable to competitors or collapsing completely. And the people in charge of these businesses risk their personal finances, their reputations, and their careers. And finally, both politicians, businesses, and business leaders would be at extreme risk if their settlement effort should suffer a disaster or fail completely. The public outcry would be enormous, and so would the backlash, especially if there was significant loss of life. And let's be real, people. Settlers are going to die trying to civilize the lunar frontier. Frontiers are dangerous, and people die. All right, so who is going to settle the moon? I think it'll be small groups of people equipped with the appropriate frontier-enabling technology that established our initial settlements. See, we've been trying to do this all backwards. The correct sequence for any settlement is people create places from the empty wilderness. Once those places have enough people, governments and businesses create the transportation infrastructure to link those places to existing markets. There are very few historical examples of governments or businesses pushing transportation infrastructures into pure wilderness to create civilization. Now, those places aren't frontiers anymore, and the risk for governments and businesses is substantially reduced, and everybody can conduct their businesses as they like. In the Lunar Homestead concept, the risk is assumed by the group and their backers. The public, politicians, Wall Street, and everyone else are just spectators. Now, I'm a technical guy, not a finance or policy guy, so feel free to tell me why I'm wrong. I'm always willing to adjust my ideas based on new data. Anyway, that's the general idea. There's lots more information on my website if you're interested. All right, so let's move on to the meat of the presentation. Frontier enabling technology is the key to any off-Earth settlement. And honestly, much of what's being pushed out now is very high-tech and probably not really appropriate for frontier settlements. Lunar cast iron habitat pressure hulls could be a piece of this technology. The most critical component of any space settlement is the pressurized habitat. Sure, a functioning settlement needs lots of other technology, but no habitat equals no people. And you can't have a settlement without people. Besides, we need a cool container to put all the other nifty gadgets we're going to make into it. And sustainable is the key word here. Any reliance on Earth for habitat construction materials and equipment is a dangerous vulnerability for lunar settlements. Long and complicated supply lines are the foundation for a disaster. Plus, settlements need to expand at their own pace. Tying habitat construction to Earth will just slow them down. So we're going to focus on habitat pressure hulls that are made from locally available materials using equipment that is also built from locally available materials. Fortunately, lunar homesteaders will have a relatively easy access to significant amounts of iron in the form of Mare basalt. Additionally, the technology required to extract the iron and form it into pressure hulls should be simple enough to be manufactured locally. This project builds on my Shielded Pressurized Oxygen Resource Extraction, or SPORE project. I presented on SPORE at the last LDC. You can check out my website to get more information on this project to put it in context. All right, so why iron? Iron is a common element on the moon. There's iron oxides, nanophase iron, small iron particles in the Mare regolith. However, if we're smart, we're going to avoid the regolith altogether. I'm presenting on why mining the mega regolith is a much better option than the regolith at our first Moon Society virtual chapter meeting next week on July 15th. You can find out more information about the chapter on the Moon Society website, and we'd love to see you there. Okay, so fortunately, there's also iron below the regolith. The lunar mega regolith is a layer of large-scale ejecta that lies beneath the regolith. We think the mega regolith is primarily made up of broken blocks of volcanic basalt and has the same chemical composition as the regolith above it. I've selected the Apollo 12 site as the Lunar Homestead reference site because of the wide variability between sample sites. It's much easier to design stuff if you eliminate much of that variation. All right, so you can see here, there's 3 types of basalt that make up the majority of the Apollo 12 sample material we've covered. There's ilmenite, which is the most abundant oxide in lunar rocks. There's olivine and pigeonite. As you can see, they're all made up of a lot of oxygen. All right, sorry, a lot of iron. So one of the first industrial activities any settlement will do will be the extraction of oxygen. And we get oxygen and iron from basalt iron oxides by using a simple hydrogen reduction process. Other metals, such as aluminum and titanium, are more complicated. I looked and I couldn't find any information on extracting iron oxygen from pigeonite using a hydrogen reduction process. And I also looked and couldn't find any information on extracting aluminum from basalt that didn't use acids or other exotic materials. And we can get titanium oxide from reducing ilmenite, but then we need more energy and equipment to make that into actual titanium metal. So it sounds like a lot more research is needed. So let's do a little exercise. I don't have the time to get into all the math, but imagine a habitat hull 8 meters by 8 meters by 10 meters and 4 centimeters thick. We excavate and process enough Mare mega regolith basalt to house this habitat. In the end, we end up with enough iron to build the next habitat, plus a lot of extra iron to build anything else we might want, equipment, whatever. The takeaway is that the moon has plenty of iron to build habitats. especially since basaltic mare deposits occupy 17% of the lunar surface and are thought to be up to several kilometers thick, which is a lot thicker than the regolith. That's enough iron for many generations of lunar homesteaders. All right. Lunar cast iron is going to be a different animal than the standard cast iron on Earth. Typical cast iron has a high carbon content along with other elements. Instead, this research is focused on using pure iron instead of an iron carbon alloy. I want to see if we can use the iron we extract from basalt without any modifications. And yes, carbon makes iron stronger, it makes steel, but carbon is also pretty rare on the moon, and we're going to want to reserve it for other processes besides bulk construction. And the same goes for other resources, energy inputs, equipment, and processes. Less is better in this case. Anyway, here's a small comparison between typical high carbon cast iron, a common low carbon steel, and pure cast iron. The data on the pure cast iron is kind of iffy because I only found one old paper on the topic, but that's okay because I plan to research it anyway in the future. Notice that the lunar cast iron properties are equivalent to or better than the cast iron and low carbon steel. I know there are other important properties to compare, but this is a small slide in a short presentation. There are a lot of parameters to consider when comparing habitat construction material and techniques. I only have time to cover 3 today. So let's see how lunar cast iron stacks up against some of the more popular habitat ideas. The first parameter is the level of ISRU. By the way, in situ resource utilization, or ISRU, is just a fancy way of saying use the resources that are locally available. Maximizing ISRU is critical because it reduces the settlement's dependence on Earth. History has shown us that long and fragile supply lines invariably lead to tragedy. Okay, so cast lunar iron scores pretty high because there's lots of iron, it's probably a decent building material, and it should be a relatively straightforward process to extract it. Pre-assembled and inflatable habitats don't have much ISRU potential. Everything is built and shipped from Earth. 3D printing scores a bit higher because it uses regolith as the primary construction material. Unfortunately, most of the ideas I've seen also need some kind of binder material that has to come from Earth. I did read about one idea that uses extruded melted regolith, which does not sound either easy to build or to use. And sintered regolith is kind of similar to 3D printing, only instead of using a binder, the regolith is fused together using microwaves or focused solar energy. The good news is that no other resources are needed. The bad news is that sintered material is rather weak, and I'm not sure I'd trust it enough to live inside of. You'll notice that using regolith is in red. That's deliberate because I think that disturbing the regolith on a large scale is a bad idea. Many designs rely on regolith to provide radiation shielding, even if they don't use it as a building material. This is a form of ISRU. Ideas span from bricks to sandbags to just piling loose regolith on top. I don't have the time to get into it here, but the lunar regolith has a lot of dust, and this dust is bad news. Any plan that includes messing with the regolith is going to be automatically more complex, more difficult, and more dangerous. A lot of lunar habitat construction schemes require some pretty high-tech equipment to pull it off. Now, don't get me wrong, I love tech just as much as the next space nerd, but I wouldn't want to rely on it when the closest repair shop or parts depot is nearly 400,000 kilometers away. So humans have been building stuff with iron for a very long time. We know it pretty well. Nothing I've seen dictates any particularly high-tech or exotic equipment. In fact, we might be able to make it so low-tech that settlers can build more construction equipment on their own. This would increase their independence and safety while letting them expand at their own pace. Pre-assembled and inflatable habitats, by their nature, have to be very high-tech. Any mass savings is a direct transportation cost savings, and mass savings requires some technology. Plus, they're deployed on the lunar surface. More on that in a second. 3D printed and sintered habitats have 2 major problems. First, they're using regolith, a material we don't have any real experience with, especially in its native environment. The second problem, which is the second problem. Both of these concepts require advanced robots to operate reliably for long periods of time in an extremely difficult environment. That's like the definition of high tech. I've highlighted the word surface because the lunar surface is a bad place to be. Not only does it have lots of regolith dust, it also has high levels of radiation and a bunch of other hazards. Did I mention the dust? Working and living on the surface mandates using high technology. And finally, I want to talk briefly about how close we are to actually seeing this stuff on the moon. The sad fact is that most of this equipment and technology still needs significant research. Lunar cast iron habitat pressure hulls still need a lot of research. The slide after next goes into a little more detail. However, we could build a lunar outpost pretty quickly using pre-assembled habitats. A lot of people like to use starships for that. Note I said outpost and not settlement. Those are two very different things. The inhabitants of outposts will put up with a lot more danger and inconvenience than settlers will. And pressurized cans sitting on the lunar surface will be a very dangerous place to work. Using pre-assembled habitats to build settlements is another thing entirely. We would have to solve for all the environmental challenges being on the surface presents. Inflatables are in an even worse position because they have all the problems of pre-assembled habitats, plus all the unknowns of a very immature technology. Only a couple of inflatable habitats have been deployed in orbit. None have been deployed on the lunar surface. We don't have much information at all on how they're going to react with indirect contact with regolith. There is a lot of research and testing between now and seeing safe inflatable habitats on the moon. 3D printing and sintering are at the bottom of the readiness pile. They not only have to research, design, build, and prove their hull material, they also have to research, design, build, and prove the robots that will build the hull material. We've been working on these problems for decades, and lunar settlements still seem very far away. Perhaps it's time to try something new. So let's quickly go through the entire process. Chunks of basalt are mined from the Mare regolith using my spore concept. Mining underground is the safest place to be on the moon. These chunks are reduced to a fine powder. This is a simple drawing of my manual universal power supply idea that's on the website. The powder may or may not need to be sorted to maximize the iron oxide content. Iron and oxygen are extracted from the basalt powder, probably using a hydrogen reduction process. The hydrogen would probably be brought from Earth, but that's okay because it isn't consumed in the process. We would simply electrolyze the water produced back into hydrogen and oxygen. Iron powder is melted and poured into hull component casts. One of the Lunar Homestead rules is we should do as much as possible inside the habitat. That way we don't have to design complex equipment to deal with the lunar surface environment. We will probably have to beef up the cooling system, however. The hull components are assembled and sealed. I'm using spore for this part as well. There's still a lot of details to work out, however. And now you got a new empty habitat that you're ready to fill up with life support and everything else you need. All right, you're probably thinking that there's a lot of research needed to get from step 1 to step 6, and you are correct. Here's a list of some of the research we're going to need for this project. I couldn't fit everything in one slide, but there is a ton more. Lunar Homestead is currently working on a couple of these, but the end goal of everything is to have blueprints, prototypes, detailed instructions on how to transform lunar Mare basalt into a pressurized hull ready to be outfitted as habitats and make it open source and available to everybody. And that way you give people the appropriate frontier enabling technology to go out and actually do it. And as you can see, we got a long way to go, but this could be the beginning of a space iron age. All right, here are some of the sources I used to make this presentation. It's being recorded. You can go back and check those out later. All right, you can help. You can be an active participant in this research. You can learn more about it at Lunar Homestead, but basically, you don't have to have a PhD or a fancy lab to conduct research. Basic research such as searching the internet, databases, papers, journals, we got information scattered all over the place, and you can help us put it all in one spot. And I'd like to mention the Moon Society's Lunarpedia as the spot to put everything. So if that interests you, anybody can do research. You can get involved in Lunar Homestead projects if they inspire you or interest you. And finally, if you have ideas that aren't being addressed that you would like to research, contact me. Let's figure out, maybe I can help you get those started. There is so much we don't know that is not being addressed. And we've got to solve these problems before people actually settle. And you can be a part of it. Everybody can be a part of it. So thank you for your time, and I'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Terrific, Ben. Thank you very much. I'm curious if you could expand on the idea of a lunar iron age. I mean, I just think that's an evocative and powerful sentence. What do you think that means? What do you think that means?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. One, there's a lot of iron, like I said. It's going to be an easily
Right. Yep.
Material. It's a lot easier to extract iron than it is to extract aluminum or titanium, because those require more energy, more equipment, more processes. So iron is going to be something we get, and we get a lot of, especially if we're using basalt, Mare basalt, to extract oxygen. So it's going to be a common material, so we might as well use it for as much as we can. And then the second thing is that this technique and a lot of the other stuff I'm working on is pretty easily modified for Mars. And Mars has got a lot of iron as well. Right. I mean, it's iron oxide on the surface.
Right. Yep.
So it wouldn't take a lot of tweaking to do the same stuff on Mars. And, iron's everywhere in the solar system. So you could use it on a lot of different places. And even if you land somewhere that doesn't have a lot of iron, if you're still making your pressure hulls out of some locally available material, all you're doing is adding some complexity, equipment, and steps, and hopefully not too much extra material, exotic material that have to be brought in. But the point is that if we're actually going to move out into the solar system, we need to have foundational technology that is simple, reliable, and usable in a lot of places. And that's kind of what I'm working on.
Nice. Very interesting. I've not ever done any iron smithing. I don't really know the chemistry or engineering behind it. Can you describe, if you know, what those earliest experiments would look like and what kind of results you want to get out of those?
Yeah, well, there's several. Ideally, what I'd like to do is take some basalt and follow the steps that I outlined in the.
Yeah, could you pull up that slide? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, right. So ideally, I'm working from the most basic stuff. So I want to figure out the ISRU habitat problem first, and then start filling in the gaps. Like the next thing will be energy, and then air, and then water, and then, go sequentially down the line. So ideally, what I want to be able to do is take raw basalt, which I have in the garage, it's basalt gravel, grind it up into powder, which is what my MUPS I'm working on is a manual system to do it, because I want to see how low tech we can get away with. I believe that any strong civilization has to have low tech fail safes to fall back on when the high tech stuff fails, because everything breaks at some point, usually at the worst possible time.
Right.
So I want to see, can we grind up basalt into a powder using manual processes? It's not ideal, but hey, what are you going to do during the long lunar night when you don't have the energy to actually grind up basalt? You need a little exercise anyway, right? So combine the two things. And then, there's other things with that project, but so you grind up the basalt into a powder. We got to figure out, do we need to separate the powder out to make it more high grade? That's part of the problem. But then it gets fed into a black box at the moment. where you put hydrogen in, you put energy in, the whole thing churns and it kicks out water and it drops out sponge iron and then titanium oxide. And unfortunately, the iron's embedded in the titanium oxide, so you got to find a way to get that out. And then once that's done, then you've got this iron, you got to melt it, pour it into casts to make your habitat hull components. That may or may not be the best way to go, but that's where I'm going from. It seems simplest. And if that doesn't work, then we go for another thing. And then once you got the components together, you assemble them, you seal them, and then you're done, theoretically. And then you fill it all up with all the life support and all that other stuff you need to do. And so using my spore concept, it's basically a shielded tunnel. It's a tunneling shield. So as you're moving forward, you're mining, refining, and then you're using the iron components that you've just casted to build the hull as you move forward. So it's a cyclical process.
We only have 2 more minutes. I just want to share a couple of quick comments. First, somebody from one of the attendees responded, finally, exclamation, a pragmatist, which that's near and dear to my heart. So
thank you. I appreciate
that. There's a couple of questions about environmental impact studies, which I'd like to talk about, but the following speaker in just a moment is he says, great to see underground facilities. I have a chart on that. So I also think that's really interesting. So going into Madhu's question, I've lost it. Oh, here we go. Yeah, we do hard things so they become easy later. We'll need to do a serious environmental impact study before we homestead Luna. What kind of impact are you thinking you're going to have? Let's just take a super small single site, not a multi, tens or 20s or 50 people at a place. What kind of impact do you think you're going to have with a small family in one of your homesteads?
Minimal. Because one of the key concepts is avoid the regolith. So you sink a vertical shaft down, 10 meters, whatever it takes to get beyond the regolith into the mega regolith. Because we think, and everything, you got to remember, everything we know about the moon is we think. We've got less than a dozen sample sites. We've only got, core samples that go down less than 3 meters. So we really don't know much, but we think that particle size increases with depth. So the further down you go, the less dust you deal with. And that makes sense because the dust is a process of impact gardening, and that only happens on the very surface. So you sink a shaft down and you do all your building underground. The only thing on the surface that you need is solar power collection, communications, and transportation. And I've got ideas about putting that subsurface too. So from a visual impact, you're not going to have a lot, even if you got thousands of homesteads everywhere, because we're not touching the regolith because the stuff is just awful to deal with. As for an environmental impact study, I guess I'm different than most other people. I say give people the technology and turn them loose. Let it be the Wild West. Yeah, it's going to be messy. It's going to be chaotic. I'm
and
sure
people will die.
Violence.
People will die.
Just because it's space doesn't mean humans aren't going to be humans. So
right.
All the stuff we deal with on Earth, just move it up to the moon. I really oppose this idea of we need to hyper-regulate the whole thing and only select entities get to be the gatekeepers on who gets to go settle space.
Right.
Well, one, it slows everything down to, I would say, a crawl, but a crawl is moving fast. And really, who gets to make those decisions? I would rather just turn it loose, let everybody go who wants to go, and just see how it all turns out and just deal with the chaos, because that would be the best way to get us out into the solar system, in my opinion.
Fascinating. I love the idea of a lunar Iron Age. I think that's going to stick with me long after this event. All right, Ben, thank you very much.